The night began like any other in our small Minnesota police station. It was late June, the kind of warm, still evening that lulled the entire town into a quiet slumber. I was finishing up paperwork at my desk, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. Pete, one of the older officers, sat across the room, chatting with the chief while they worked on a jigsaw puzzle. The quiet was shattered when the station's front door swung open. A young woman stumbled inside, soaking wet and trembling. Her hair clung to her face, and her dress, old-fashioned and drenched, clung to her small frame. She was breathing heavily, her eyes wide and frantic, like a cornered animal. "Please," she gasped, "you have to help me." The three of us froze, startled by her sudden appearance. I exchanged a glance with Pete before stepping toward her. "What's wrong, ma'am?" the chief asked, his voice calm and steady. She looked over her shoulder as if expecting someone to burst through the door. "Someone kidnapped me," she said. "I managed to escape, but they'll come after me." Her words sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. Kidnappings were unheard of in our sleepy town. "Come sit down," the chief said, gesturing to a chair. "We'll sort this out. Pete, get her a blanket." Pete nodded and hurried off. The young woman sank into the chair, shivering. Up close, I noticed her pale skin and how the dark circles under her eyes gave her a ghostly appearance. The chief handed her a cup of coffee from the pot on his desk. "Thank you," she murmured, though she didn't take a sip. Her hands shook as she held the mug, her gaze fixed on the floor. "What's your name?" the chief asked, pulling a notepad from his desk drawer. "Shirley," she said. "Shirley McDougall." The name didn't ring any bells. In a town this small, you knew most of the residents by name, or at least by face. But Shirley was a complete stranger. "How old are you, Shirley?" 22, she replied quietly. Pete returned with a blanket, draping it over her shoulders. She pulled it tightly around herself, but the shivering didn't stop. "Where do you live?" the chief continued, jotting down notes. "Above my parents' hardware store," she said. "McDougall's Hardware on Main Street." I glanced at Pete. He looked just as puzzled as I felt. There was no hardware store by that name on Main Street. There hadn't been for decades. "How long have you lived here?" the chief asked, his tone careful. "My whole life," she answered. Pete and I exchanged another look. This didn't make sense. If she had lived here her whole life, why didn't any of us recognize her? And why was she dressed like she had stepped out of a different era? "Why don't you tell us what happened tonight?" the chief prompted. Shirley hesitated, her fingers tightening around the mug. "I was walking home from the movies," she began. "Me and my friends went to see the new Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis film at the Mayan Theater." The Mayan Theater? That place had been closed for years, replaced by a liquor store in the late 70s. My stomach tightened as I tried to make sense of her words. "Afterward, I stopped at Beckman's drugstore for a chocolate malt," she continued. That's when he approached me. "Who?" the chief asked, leaning forward. "An older man," Shirley said. "He had silver hair and walked with a crutch. He said he needed help finding his wallet, that it had fallen under the seat of his car." "What kind of car?" the chief interrupted gently. "A Buick," she replied. "A dark one, maybe 2 or 3 years old. I didn't think anything of it. He seemed harmless, so I went with him to his car." My stomach churned as she recounted the next part. "When I knelt down to look under the seat, he hit me on the head, hard. The next thing I knew, he was dragging me around to the trunk. He shoved me inside and slammed the lid shut. I was screaming, pounding on the inside of the trunk, but he just kept driving." "How did you escape?" the chief asked, his voice low. "He crashed," Shirley said, her voice trembling. "I don't know how. The car swerved and suddenly I was underwater. He must have driven into a lake or something. I don't remember how I got out, but I swam to the shore and started walking back into town." She fell silent, her breathing ragged. The chief put down his pen and leaned back in his chair. Pete and I stared at each other, both of us struggling to process what we had just heard. It was the kind of story you'd expect to hear in a big city, not in our quiet little town. "May I use the phone?" Shirley asked suddenly. "I need to call my parents. They must be worried sick." "Of course," the chief said. "Just one moment." He motioned for me and Pete to follow him into the hallway. Once we were out of earshot, he lowered his voice. "Something's not adding up," he said. "The Mayan Theater, Beckman's drugstore, McDougall's Hardware, those places haven't existed in decades." Pete nodded. You think she's making it up? The chief frowned. I don't know, but we need to figure out who she is and where she came from. Until then, keep an eye on her. Something about this just doesn't sit right. I nodded, but a knot of unease had already settled in my gut. Shirley McDougall's story was just beginning, and I had the sinking feeling it was about to get much stranger. As the chief returned to the office, Pete and I exchanged a look. Something about Shirley McDougall felt undeniably wrong, and yet there she was, trembling, soaked, and clinging to her story. The air in the station felt heavier as we stepped back into the room. Shirley was staring out the window now, the blanket still wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her pale reflection in the glass looked as ghostly as the story she'd told us. Here, the chief said, handing her the phone. You can call your parents. Her hands shook as she took the receiver and dialed, her movements slow and deliberate. She waited, her wide eyes fixed on the desk as the line rang. Then she frowned, a look of confusion clouding her face. They're not answering, she murmured, lowering the phone. They should be home by now. The chief reached for his notebook. Why don't you give me their number? I'll try to reach them later. Shirley hesitated, then nodded, reciting a number that sounded oddly short. The chief raised an eyebrow but said nothing, jotting it down before taking the phone back. Miss McDougall, I said carefully, can you tell us a little more about your parents' hardware store? You said it's on Main Street? She nodded. Yes. McDougall's Hardware. My father runs it. I've worked there part-time since I was a teenager. Pete scratched the back of his neck. How long has it been there? Since before I was born, she said with a faint smile. Everyone in town knows it. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. McDougall's Hardware hadn't existed for decades. I'd heard about it in passing, a long-defunct store that burned down in the 1960s. The owners, Wilbur and Harriet McDougall, had died in the fire. They had no surviving family, at least none anyone in town had ever mentioned. The chief tapped his pen against the desk. Shirley, why don't you tell us about tonight? Start from the moment you left the theater. Her gaze flickered to the floor and she gripped the edges of the blanket tighter. I left the Mayan Theater around 9, she said. My friends and I had gone to see the new Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis movie. Afterward, I stopped by Beckman's drugstore for a chocolate malt. That's when... She trailed off, her eyes glistening with tears. That's when the man approached you, the chief prompted gently. She nodded, biting her lip. He looked harmless, an older man with silver hair and a crutch. He said he needed help finding his wallet under his car seat. Pete frowned. And you went with him? I didn't think anything of it, she admitted, but as soon as I bent down to look, he hit me. Hard. I don't remember much after that. When I woke up, I was in the trunk of his car. And then the crash happened? I asked. Yes, she said, her voice trembling. The car swerved and went off the road. I think it landed in a lake. The trunk filled with water, and I thought I was going to drown. But somehow I managed to get out and swim to the shore. I started walking back to town, and that's when I came here. The room fell silent as we processed her words. The story was harrowing, but the details, the theater, the drugstore, the hardware store, didn't line up with anything from the present day. It was as if she were describing a version of the town from decades ago. Shirley, the chief said, his voice cautious, do you know what year it is? Her brow furrowed. Of course I do. It's 1954. My heart skipped a beat. Pete's jaw dropped, and the chief's pen slipped from his hand, clattering onto the desk. What did you say? The chief asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It's 1954, she repeated, her expression confused. Why? What's wrong? For a moment, none of us knew how to respond. Finally, the chief stood, his face pale. Pete, why don't you get her some dry clothes from the back? And officer, he said, turning to me, a word in private. I followed him into the hallway, my pulse racing. Once we were out of earshot, he leaned in, his voice low and urgent. What the hell is going on? I shook my head. I don't know. But if she really thinks it's 1954, that's impossible, he interrupted, though his tone lacked conviction. There's got to be an explanation for this. Delusion, trauma, something. And the details? I pressed. The Mayan Theater? Beckman's drugstore? McDougall's Hardware? Those places haven't existed in decades. The chief didn't reply. Instead, he ran a hand through his hair and let out a long, slow breath. Let's keep her here for now, he said finally. I'll make some calls, see if we can figure out who she really is. But keep an eye on her. Something about this doesn't sit right. I nodded, though unease gnawed at me. Shirley McDougall's story wasn't just strange, it was impossible. And yet, deep down, I had the sinking feeling that we were only scratching the surface of a much darker mystery. The station felt unnaturally quiet after the chief's revelation. I returned to the main office to find Shirley sitting in the same chair, her blanket drawn tightly around her. Pete had handed her a dry set of clothes from the station's lost and found box, but she still seemed small and frail under the oversized sweatshirt and jeans. Are you feeling better? I asked, trying to keep my tone light. She nodded weakly. I just want to go home. I exchanged a glance with Pete, who was leaning against the counter, arms crossed. He gave me a slight shake of his head, a silent reminder that we still didn't have any clear answers. I turned back to Shirley. We're working on that, I assured her. In the meantime, why don't you tell us more about your family? Maybe we can help you get in touch with them. Her lips twitched into a faint smile. My parents are good people, she said softly. They've worked so hard to keep the hardware store running. My father, Tech Wilbur, he's always fixing things around town. And my mother, Harriet, she's the heart of the family. I leaned forward, careful not to startle her. And your friends? Do you have anyone you spend time with? She brightened slightly at the mention of friends. Oh, yes, Linda and Betty. We always go to the Mayan Theater together on weekends. They're probably worried about me. I don't want them to think I've disappeared. Disappeared. The word sent a chill through me. From what little I knew of the McDougall family's tragic history, their daughter had vanished in 1954, only weeks before the hardware store fire claimed her parents' lives. Could Shirley's story, her appearance, somehow connect to that past? Before I could say more, the chief returned to the room, his expression grim. He held a thick binder of Old Town records under his arm and set it down on the desk with a heavy thud. Shirley, he said, his voice gentle but firm, I need you to look at something. She tilted her head, curious but wary. The chief opened the binder to a faded black and white photograph of a family. The image showed a man and a woman, standing proudly in front of a modest storefront labeled McDougall's Hardware. Between them stood a teenage girl, her hair styled in soft curls, wearing a dress eerily similar to the one Shirley had arrived in. Do you recognize these people? The chief asked, sliding the binder toward her. Shirley's eyes widened as she stared at the photo. Her hands trembled as she reached out to touch the image. That's my family, she whispered, her voice breaking. That's me. Pete let out a low whistle, and I felt my stomach drop. Her reaction wasn't one of confusion or hesitation. It was genuine recognition. Shirley, the chief said carefully, this photo was taken in 1953. The McDougall family owned the hardware store back then. But he hesitated, as if weighing his next words. The store burned down in 1954. Your parents didn't survive. She stared at him, her pale face turning ashen. No, she said, shaking her head. That's not true. I just saw them this morning. I had breakfast with my mother before going to the movies. This has to be a mistake. The room fell silent. None of us knew how to respond. How do you explain to someone that their very existence defies the passage of time? Shirley, I began, choosing my words carefully. What's the last thing you remember before coming here? She blinked, tears forming in her eyes. The lake, she whispered. The water was so cold. I thought I was going to die. But then, she trailed off, her gaze distant. I saw a light. I thought it was the moon at first, but it wasn't. It was warm, like someone reaching out to me. And then I was here. The chief's hand tightened on the edge of the desk. Pete looked like he wanted to say something, but thought better of it. I could feel the weight of their unease mirroring my own. Chief, I said softly, what do we do now? He shook his head. I don't know, but until we figure this out, she stays here. No one leaves, and no one comes in without my say-so. Shirley's breathing quickened, and she clutched the edges of her blanket. You believe me, don't you? She asked, her voice trembling. I'm not crazy. I'm telling the truth. I met her eyes and nodded. We'll figure this out, Shirley, I promise. But deep down, I wasn't sure if any of us were ready for the answers we were about to uncover. The weight of Shirley's claim hung heavy in the station. Pete busied himself with small tasks, but I could see the tension in his movements. The chief sat at his desk, flipping through the town records, his face etched with worry. And Shirley? She stayed quiet, her hands trembling as she stared at the photograph of her family. "Do you know what happened to the man who took you?" I asked her gently, breaking the silence. Shirley's head jerked up, her expression clouded with fear. "I don't know," she whispered. "After the crash, I didn't see him. I just swam and swam until I reached the shore. He might still be out there." Pete frowned. "If her story checks out, we should search the lake." "The problem," the chief interjected, "is figuring out which lake. If this happened in 1954, that car could be at the bottom of any body of water in the area. And that's assuming the story is—" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Authentic." Shirley's eyes welled with tears. "I'm not lying," she said, her voice trembling. "Why won't anyone believe me?" I crouched beside her chair. "We believe you," I said, though my voice betrayed my uncertainty. "We're just trying to understand. Everything you've told us, it's not what we're used to hearing. But we'll get to the truth. I promise." The chief cleared his throat. "I'll call the state police, see if they have records on missing persons or accidents from that time. Pete, get the map. Let's pinpoint the lakes near where McDougall's hardware used to be." While Pete spread the map across the desk, I turned back to Shirley. "Do you remember anything else about the area? Landmarks? Road signs?" She thought for a moment, then nodded. "There was a bridge, a wooden one. I saw it just before we crashed, and there were tall trees on both sides of the road." I glanced at Pete, who was already scanning the map. "There," he said, pointing to a spot about 10 miles out of town. "That old county road had a wooden bridge before they replaced it in the 60s. There's a small lake nearby." "Good work," the chief said. "We'll send someone out in the morning to check it out." Shirley looked relieved, but the tension in the room remained palpable. None of us wanted to say it aloud, but the implications of her story were impossible to ignore. If she was telling the truth, then time itself had somehow fractured, leaving her stranded in a world decades removed from her own. Later that night, the station grew quiet. Pete had gone home, and the chief was in his office making calls. I stayed with Shirley, keeping an eye on her as she drifted between restless sleep and fitful wakefulness. Around midnight, I heard it. A faint tapping sound, like fingernails drumming against glass. My pulse quickened as I turned toward the window. Outside, the street was deserted, the lamplight casting long shadows across the pavement. "Did you hear that?" Shirley whispered, her eyes wide. "Stay here," I said, reaching for my flashlight. I stepped outside, the cool night air wrapping around me like a shroud. The tapping sound had stopped, but a strange feeling of being watched prickled the back of my neck. I scanned the area, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. When I returned, Shirley was sitting upright, her blanket clutched tightly around her. "It's him," she said, her voice barely audible. "The man with the crutch. He's looking for me." "You're safe here," I assured her, though my words felt hollow. "No one can get to you." But as I sat down beside her, I couldn't shake the feeling that she might be right. Something was out there, watching, waiting. And whatever it wasn't finished with Shirley McDougall. The next morning, Pete and I drove out to the old county road Shirley had described. The chief had called the state police, but they wouldn't arrive until later. It was up to us to see if there was anything to her story, anything that could explain what had happened. The wooden bridge Shirley mentioned was long gone, replaced by a concrete overpass decades ago. But the lake remained, its still waters reflecting the gray morning sky. We parked by the side of the road and stepped out, the crunch of gravel beneath our boots breaking the quiet. "You think we'll find anything?" Pete asked, his tone skeptical. I shrugged, scanning the area. "Only one way to find out." We made our way down the embankment to the lake's edge. The air was cold and damp, and a faint mist clung to the surface of the water. Pete unpacked a set of binoculars while I walked along the shoreline, looking for any sign of a disturbance. It didn't take long to find it. About 20 feet from the shore, a patch of dark, murky water stood out against the otherwise clear lake. I called Pete over, and he peered through the binoculars. "Looks like something's down there," he said, lowering the binoculars. "Could be a car." My stomach tightened. Let's mark the spot and wait for the divers. We placed a flag by the water's edge and radioed the chief. He confirmed the dive team would arrive within the hour. In the meantime, we waited, the tension between us growing with each passing minute. When the state police arrived with their dive team, Pete and I stood back, watching as they prepared their equipment. The lead diver, a grizzled man named Hank, approached us. "You sure about this spot?" he asked, his tone doubtful. "There's definitely something down there," I said. "We just don't know what." Hank nodded and signaled to his team. They waded into the water, their movements slow and deliberate. We watched as they disappeared beneath the surface, leaving only ripples behind. The wait felt endless. Pete paced nervously while I kept my eyes fixed on the water. Finally, after what felt like hours, Hank emerged, pulling off his mask. His expression was grim. "We found a car," he said, his voice heavy. "It's an old Buick, been down there a long time." Pete let out a low whistle. Shirley wasn't lying. "That's not all," Hank added. "There's a body in the driver's seat. Looks like a man, but we won't know more until we get it up." My heart sank. "And the trunk?" Hank hesitated. "Empty. Whatever happened to the girl she mentioned, she wasn't in there." Back at the station, the chief reviewed the dive team's preliminary report. The car's license plate was registered to a man suspected of multiple kidnappings and murders across the Midwest in the 1950s. The case had gone cold after his sudden disappearance, but now we had the missing piece of the puzzle. When I told Shirley what we'd found, her reaction wasn't what I expected. She didn't cry or express relief. Instead, she looked at me with a strange mix of fear and resignation. "He's still here," she said quietly. I frowned. "What do you mean?" "The man with the crutch," she replied, her voice trembling. "I saw him last night, outside the window. He's not gone. Not really." My blood ran cold. "Shirley, it's not possible. He's been dead for decades." She shook her head. "You don't understand. It's not just him. It's the darkness that follows him. It's what dragged me here. And now it's coming for all of us." The room seemed to grow colder, the air heavy with an unspoken dread. I tried to dismiss her words as the product of trauma, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. Whatever had brought Shirley McDougall to us wasn't finished, and it wasn't about to let her go. The tension in the station was suffocating after Shirley's chilling claim. Pete avoided meeting my eyes, and even the chief, usually calm and collected, seemed shaken. Shirley remained in her chair, her gaze fixed on the floor, as if bracing herself for something we couldn't see. That night, the power went out. The sudden darkness plunged the station into silence, save for the faint sound of wind howling outside. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the breaker box, my pulse quickening with every step. Pete followed, his own flashlight casting erratic beams of light across the walls. "You think it's just the storm?" he asked, his voice tight. "Maybe," I replied, though I didn't believe it. The air felt charged, heavy with an unnatural energy. When we reached the breaker box, I flipped the main switch. Nothing. Pete cursed under his breath, and I felt a knot of unease tighten in my chest. As we turned to head back, a loud crash echoed through the station. It came from the main office. We sprinted back to find the room in chaos. Desks and chairs were overturned, papers scattered across the floor. Shirley was gone. "Where is she?" Pete shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "I don't know," I replied, scanning the room with my flashlight. My beam landed on the front door, which hung ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. We grabbed our coats and rushed outside. The cold wind bit at our faces as we searched the empty street. A faint sound reached my ears, a soft, melodic humming. It was coming from the direction of the old hardware store. The building was nothing more than a charred ruin, long abandoned and overgrown with weeds. As we approached, the humming grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't Shirley's voice. It was low and guttural, like a chorus of whispers layered together. Pete hesitated at the threshold. "This is a bad idea," he muttered. "You think I don't know that?" I replied, pushing forward. The air inside was colder than it should have been, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. My flashlight flickered as I swept it across the wreckage. In the center of the room, Shirley stood motionless, her back to us. She was barefoot, her blanket discarded on the floor. "Shirley!" I called, my voice echoing off the crumbling walls. She turned slowly, her eyes vacant, her expression eerily calm. "It's here," she said softly. "It's always been here." Pete stepped forward, his hand on his gun. "What are you talking about? Who's here?" Before she could answer, the shadows around her began to shift. They moved unnaturally, coalescing into a towering figure. It was the shape of a man, but its edges were undefined, like smoke caught in a draft. Its eyes burned red, twin points of malevolence that pierced the darkness. Pete froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "What the hell is that?" The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. The air grew heavier, pressing down on my chest. I could feel its presence, a cold, suffocating force that drained the strength from my limbs. Shirley looked up at the figure, her expression serene. "You can't have me," she said, her voice steady. "Not anymore." The figure stopped, its form flickering like a dying flame. For a moment it seemed to hesitate, as if unsure of itself. Then, with a sound like a distant roar, it lunged at her. I reacted without thinking. I grabbed Shirley and pulled her back, stumbling as the figure's cold energy washed over us. Pete fired his gun, the shots echoing in the confined space, but the bullets passed through the figure without effect. Shirley clutched my arm, her voice urgent. "The light! Bring it into the light!" Pete and I exchanged a bewildered glance, but there was no time to question her. I dragged her toward the doorway, Pete covering us as the figure advanced. As soon as we crossed the threshold, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, spilling golden light into the ruined building. The figure recoiled, its form unraveling like smoke in a breeze. It let out a guttural scream, the sound reverberating through the walls. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Back at the station, Shirley sat quietly, sipping a cup of tea. She looked tired, but at peace, as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "What was that thing?" Pete asked, breaking the silence. Shirley didn't answer right away. She stared into her cup, her expression thoughtful. "A shadow," she said finally, "a memory of something terrible. It fed on fear, on pain, but it's gone now." The chief arrived soon after, demanding answers we couldn't provide. The dive team's report confirmed the identity of the man in the lake, a drifter responsible for at least 6 murders across the Midwest. But the rest of Shirley's story remained a mystery. That evening, she left the station. We offered to drive her somewhere, but she declined, saying she needed to find her own way. As she walked into the fading light, I couldn't help but wonder if we'd ever see her again. Sometimes, late at night, I think about her, about the shadow, the car, the impossible story she told. And I wonder if we truly put it to rest, or if it's still out there, waiting for the next lost soul to stumble into its path. Being a cop in a small Minnesota town isn't exactly thrilling. It's quiet, peaceful, and predictable, far removed from the chaos of places like New York or LA. Our community is the kind of rural farming town you pass through without a second thought. The population is small and crime is rare. The worst I'd ever dealt with were bar fights, drunk drivers, and the occasional domestic dispute. But there was one case, one that defied logic and still gives me chills, that changed everything I thought I knew about my job. It began on a rainy afternoon in early spring, 7 years ago. I'd been a cop for 5 years by then. Our department was tiny, 5 officers, a part-time dispatcher, and the chief. My partner Jerry and I were patrolling when Karen, the dispatcher, called us over the radio. There was a report of a break-in at the Garrity house on Turner Road. Eileen Garrity wasn't a stranger to us. She was an elderly widow, known around town for being eccentric. She called the station frequently, reporting everything from burglars in her attic to UFOs in her cornfield. Each time, we found nothing. Still, we always checked things out. It was our job, after all. As Jerry and I turned onto Turner Road, I sighed, "Probably just another false alarm." Jerry nodded. "Yeah, but she's all alone out there. Better safe than sorry." When we pulled up to the Garrity house, my stomach dropped. Mrs. Garrity was on her porch, but she looked nothing like the woman we'd seen before. Her already frail frame had withered. Her hollow cheeks and sunken, bloodshot eyes made her look like she hadn't slept or eaten in days. Her gray hair was tangled, and her dirty dress hung loosely on her frame. But it was her eyes that unsettled me the most. They weren't just tired, they were haunted. "What's the problem, Mrs. Garrity?" Jerry asked gently. "There's something in my house," she whispered. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but her hands shook as she clutched her shawl. Her words sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't like her usual calls. Something about her tone, Resigned, almost defeated, felt wrong. "Don't worry," I said, trying to reassure her. "We'll take a look." Jerry and I drew our pistols as we entered the house. The inside was shocking. Dishes piled up in the sink, trash and dirty laundry were scattered everywhere, and the smell of neglect was overpowering. This was not the tidy home I remembered. We moved cautiously, checking each room. The first floor was empty, but signs of distress were everywhere. A makeshift bed on the couch, a shotgun leaning against the wall, and shattered mirrors in every room. Jerry examined the shotgun and found 2 spent shells. It had been fired recently. As we moved upstairs, the eerie silence was broken only by the sound of rain. The bedroom was abandoned, dust-covered furniture and a bare mattress. Back downstairs, we noticed the closet doors had been boarded shut. One door had a massive hole, the wood splintered with buckshot. Jerry glanced at me, his brow furrowed. I shook my head. I had no answers. When we finished searching, we returned to Mrs. Garrity, now sitting on the couch, staring at the floor. "We didn't find anyone," Jerry said. "Looks like they're gone, if they were ever here." But instead of relaxing, her face crumpled into despair. "It's still here," she murmured. "It's hiding. You couldn't find it, but it'll come back. It always comes back." Her words hung in the air like a dark cloud. Jerry and I exchanged uneasy glances. This was no ordinary case. Something had pushed this woman to the edge, and we were about to discover how deep the darkness went. After hearing Mrs. Garrity's unsettling words, Jerry and I exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't the eccentric, harmless old woman we were used to dealing with. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. We needed answers. We sat down with her in the dimly lit living room. Rain tapped against the windows as the old woman clutched a cup of tea Jerry had made for her. She stared into the cup, her hands trembling. "Can you tell us what's been happening, Mrs. Garrity?" I asked, keeping my voice calm and steady. She was silent for a long moment, as though trying to summon the courage to speak. Then, in a soft, trembling voice, she began to recount her story. "It started about a month ago," she said. "At first, it was just scratching, soft, slow scratching, coming from my bedroom closet. I thought it was a mouse, maybe a raccoon, but when I opened the door, there was nothing there." She paused, her hollow eyes darting toward the boarded-up closet door at the end of the hall. "The scratching didn't stop. It got louder, more deliberate, like something was trying to claw its way out. I couldn't sleep. I locked the door every night, but it didn't matter. The scratching would start again, always at night, always from inside the closet. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine." The way she described it, the deliberate, persistent nature of the sound, sent a chill through the room. "Why didn't you call us sooner?" Jerry asked gently. Mrs. Garrity's lips quivered as she tried to find the words. "I thought I was imagining it," she admitted. "I didn't want to bother you. People already think I'm crazy. But it wasn't just scratching." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "It started talking to me." Jerry and I exchanged a sharp look. "Talking?" I pressed, leaning forward. "At first, it was my husband's voice," she said, her words trembling. "Bill's voice. He's been gone for 3 years, but it sounded just like him. It called out to me, telling me to open the closet. It said God had sent him back to take me to heaven." The room felt colder. My chest tightened as I listened. "What did you do?" "I almost opened it," she confessed, her eyes filling with tears. "But something stopped me. It sounded like Bill, but it wasn't him. The way it spoke, it wasn't right. There was something off. When I refused, the voice changed. It got angry, violent. It started cursing at me, threatening me." Her hands gripped the edge of the couch. "It banged on the door so hard I thought it would break through. I ran downstairs and stayed on the couch. That's when I started sleeping down here. I couldn't bear to go back to my bedroom." The shotgun suddenly made sense. She must have felt so desperate, so terrified that she armed herself. I glanced at Jerry, whose expression mirrored my own. Disbelief mingled with unease. "And the mirrors?" I asked, nodding toward the shattered glass. Mrs. Garrity shuddered. "I saw it," she said, her voice barely audible. "Not in the closet, in the mirrors. I was in the bathroom washing my hands. When I looked up, it was there, staring back at me." Her breath quickened. "It wasn't human. It was wearing a black robe, and its face was a skull with horns. Its eyes were red, glowing like embers. It reached for me, through the glass." Jerry shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I felt the same creeping dread. So you broke them all, I said, trying to ground her story in some form of logic. She nodded. I had to. I couldn't risk seeing it again. I couldn't let it get me. The rain outside intensified as if reflecting the growing tension in the room. Mrs. Garrity's voice faltered and she buried her face in her hands. I don't know what to do, she sobbed. It's not just at night anymore. It's happening during the day too. I'm not safe. It wants me. It won't stop until it has me. Jerry placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We'll figure this out, Mrs. Garrity. You're not alone in this. I nodded, though unease gnawed at my gut. This was beyond anything I'd ever encountered. Whether it was supernatural or the result of a deteriorating mind, one thing was clear. Mrs. Garrity couldn't stay in that house alone. Let's get you out of here for tonight, I suggested. We'll find you a safe place to stay, and tomorrow we'll figure out the next steps. Her tear-streaked face turned toward me, and for the first time that evening, I saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. She nodded weakly. Thank you, she whispered. As we prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was tormenting Mrs. Garrity wasn't finished yet. The boarded-up closets, the shattered mirrors, the desperate pleas, all of it felt like the prelude to something far darker. And I couldn't help but wonder, what if she was right? Jerry and I drove Mrs. Garrity to a modest motel in town. The rain had let up, but the evening was still cloaked in a gray gloom, matching the unease in my chest. She sat silently in the back seat, her frail hands gripping her handbag tightly. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror and noticed her lips moving, a quiet, constant prayer. When we arrived, the motel clerk gave us a curious look as we checked her in, but he didn't ask questions. We got her settled in a small but clean room near the back of the building. The moment she sat on the bed, she looked like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. You'll be safe here, Jerry said, his voice steady but kind. Get some rest tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure this out together. Thank you, she whispered, her voice heavy with exhaustion. As we turned to leave, she reached out and grasped my arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone so frail. Promise me you won't go back to that house tonight, she said, her wide, pleading eyes locking onto mine. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. We won't, I assured her, though the words felt hollow. We left her with a small Bible on the nightstand and the promise of a fresh start in the morning. Back in the cruiser, Jerry was uncharacteristically quiet. The engine hummed as we pulled out of the motel parking lot. You believe her? I asked, breaking the silence. He exhaled slowly, his fingers drumming on the steering wheel. I don't know. She's definitely been through something, but this whole thing feels wrong. I nodded. Yeah, it's like there's more to it, like we're only seeing the surface of something deeper. We didn't say much else on the drive back to the station. The Garrity case lingered in the air like a bad smell, refusing to be shaken. When we arrived, the chief was waiting for us in his office. What's the story with Mrs. Garrity? He asked, leaning back in his chair, arms crossed. We recounted everything. The boarded closets, the shattered mirrors, the bizarre story of scratching and voices. The chief listened intently, his face unreadable. When we finished, he sighed and rubbed his temples. She's not safe to be on her own anymore, he said finally. We'll talk to her family tomorrow. If they won't step up, we'll see about getting her into assisted living, or maybe a facility that can help her. I nodded, relieved. What about her house? Should we check it out more thoroughly tomorrow? The chief shook his head. No sense in stirring up more trouble tonight. Let's see what tomorrow brings. With that, he dismissed us, and Jerry and I headed home for the night. But sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mrs. Garrity's haunted expression, heard her trembling voice saying, "It's not just at night anymore." The next morning, the phone rang early. It was the chief, and his tone was grim. Get to the motel, now. He didn't say why, but the urgency in his voice sent a chill through me. I threw on my uniform and drove straight there. When I arrived, Jerry and the chief were already outside, standing near a strip of crime scene tape, blocking off Mrs. Garrity's room. A pair of state police officers and a detective were talking in low voices nearby. What happened? I asked, my heart pounding. The chief's face was pale. She's gone. I blinked, confused. Gone? What do you mean, gone? I mean, she's gone, he said firmly. Vanished, no sign of her. My stomach twisted. How? The doors, the windows, all locked from the inside, Jerry interjected, his voice low. No signs of forced entry. But what? The chief gestured for me to follow him. I ducked under the tape and stepped into the motel room. The sight stopped me in my tracks. Blood splattered the walls, the floor, the bed. The sheets were torn as if someone had clung to them desperately. Thin trails of blood led from the bed to the closet door, where they abruptly ended. I swallowed hard and looked at the chief. The closet? He nodded grimly. Take a look. My legs felt heavy as I approached the closet. The door was slightly ajar. I reached out, hesitated, then pulled it open. Inside was nothing but darkness. No blood, no sign of a struggle. Just an empty space that seemed to stretch on forever. It doesn't make any sense, Jerry muttered behind me. Where the hell did she go? I didn't have an answer. None of us did. But deep down, I felt the weight of a terrifying realization. Whatever Mrs. Garrity had feared, whatever she had been running from, hadn't stayed behind in that house. It had followed her. Standing in the blood-splattered motel room, I felt the weight of the situation pressing down on me. The logical part of my mind screamed for an explanation. Some rational reason for Mrs. Garrity's disappearance. But nothing added up. The locked doors, the untouched windows, and the trails of blood ending at the empty closet defied all logic. The chief, Jerry, and I stepped outside, leaving the state police and detectives to process the scene. The morning sun tried to cut through the overcast sky, but its feeble light did little to lift the oppressive mood. So what do we do now? Jerry asked, his voice uncharacteristically shaky. The chief sighed heavily. We wait for the detectives to finish their investigation. In the meantime, I want you two to head to Garrity's house. Check it out again. See if there's anything we missed. Jerry and I nodded and climbed into the cruiser. The drive back to the Garrity house was quiet. Both of us were lost in thought, trying to piece together the impossible. As we turned onto Turner Road, the old farmhouse loomed ahead, its weathered exterior looking even more decrepit in the daylight. You ready for this? Jerry asked as we pulled into the driveway. Not really, I admitted. We stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel beneath our boots the only sound. The air around the house felt heavy, as if it held its breath, waiting for something to happen. The boards on the windows and closets were still intact, a grim reminder of Mrs. Garrity's desperate attempts to keep it at bay. Jerry pushed the front door open, and we entered cautiously, our flashlights slicing through the gloom. The house was eerily silent, save for the faint creaks and groans of its old frame. The living room was exactly as we'd left it the night before. Blankets and pillows on the couch, the shotgun leaning against the wall, and shattered glass glinting in the weak daylight. Let's start with the closets, I suggested, my voice barely above a whisper. We moved methodically through the house, prying away the boards Mrs. Garrity had nailed over the doors. The first few closets were empty, save for a few forgotten belongings, coats, shoes, a box of Christmas ornaments. But when we reached the closet in her bedroom, a sense of unease washed over me. This was the one she described in such vivid, terrifying detail. Jerry pried the boards off with a crowbar, and the closet door creaked open. Inside, the space was bare except for faint claw marks etched into the wood, 6 feet off the ground. My stomach churned as I traced the marks with my fingers. They looked deliberate, almost calculated, as if something or someone had tried to claw its way out. What the hell made these? Jerry muttered, leaning in for a closer look. I don't know, I admitted, but it's not normal. That's for sure. We closed the closet door and continued our search. When we reached the bathroom, Jerry stopped suddenly. You smell that? I sniffed the air. There was a faint, acrid odor, like burnt hair and sulfur. The smell grew stronger as we approached the shattered bathroom mirror. My pulse quickened. The room felt colder, the air heavy with something I couldn't name. Jerry crouched down, inspecting the shards of glass on the floor. Looks like there's something on the back of these, he said, holding up a shard. I leaned in. The back of the glass was streaked with black, as if smoke had somehow etched itself into the surface. That's not normal, I said, my voice tight. Jerry dropped the shard and stood up, wiping his hands on his pants. None of this is normal. Let's finish up and get out of here. As we made our way back downstairs, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every creak of the floorboards felt deliberate. By the time we reached the front door, my nerves were frayed. Let's report this to the chief, I said, stepping outside and taking a deep breath of fresh air. Whatever's going on here, it's not just in her head. Jerry nodded, his face pale. Agreed. Let's get out of here. We drove back to the station in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. The claw marks, the sulfur smell, the smoke-streaked mirror, none of it made sense. And yet it all pointed to one horrifying conclusion. Whatever had haunted Mrs. Garrity wasn't done yet, and it might still be waiting for us to make the next move. After returning to the station, Jerry and I briefed the chief on what we had found at the Garrity house. The claw marks, the sulfuric smell, the smoke-streaked mirror shards. Each detail seemed to push the case further into the realm of the inexplicable. The chief leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. I've been doing this job for 30 years, and I've never heard of anything like this. Do you think it's supernatural? Jerry and I exchanged an uneasy glance. I don't know what to think, I admitted, but something's not right. Mrs. Garrity was convinced something followed her, and if that blood trail at the motel means anything, she might have been right. The chief sighed heavily. All right, here's what we're going to do. We'll get a priest out to that house to bless it, just in case. And I'll start making calls to her family again. Someone has to take responsibility for her estate. This thing, whatever it is, needs to be put to rest. I nodded, but deep down I wasn't sure if a blessing or family intervention would solve this. Whatever was happening felt bigger than anything we could handle. That evening, as I was getting ready to head home, the phone on my desk rang. It was Karen, the part-time dispatcher. Hey, she said, her voice tinged with concern. There's a guy here asking about Mrs. Garrity. Says he's her nephew. I frowned. Her nephew? She told us her kids didn't visit, and I've never heard her mention a nephew. That's what I thought was strange, Karen replied, but he says he's in town to help with her affairs. You want me to send him over? Yeah, I'll talk to him, I said, though suspicion gnawed at me. 10 minutes later, the man walked into the station. He was tall and thin, with neatly combed gray hair and an impeccable suit. His dark eyes were sharp and unyielding, as if they could pierce through steel. Officer, he greeted, extending a hand. I'm Michael Garrity. Thank you for looking after my aunt. I shook his hand, studying his face for any sign of deceit. You'll have to excuse my surprise. Mrs. Garrity never mentioned a nephew. Michael's smile didn't reach his eyes. That's not surprising. My aunt was a private woman. But I'm here now and I want to help. I understand there's been some trouble? That's one way to put it, I said, motioning for him to sit. I recounted the events of the past 2 days, omitting some of the more inexplicable details. Michael listened intently, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. This entity you're describing, he began slowly. I've heard stories about it. I raised an eyebrow. Stories, he nodded. My aunt used to talk about something like this when I was a child. She said it haunted our family, a shadow that clung to us generation after generation. Most of us dismissed it as superstition, but my aunt believed it. A chill ran down my spine. Why didn't she tell us this? Michael's gaze hardened. Would you have believed her? Would anyone? She probably thought you'd chalk it up to dementia. I had no response to that. I want to see the house, Michael said suddenly, standing. I'm not sure that's a good idea, I replied, uneasy. There's something dangerous there. We don't even know what we're dealing with. All the more reason to confront it, he said firmly. Against my better judgment, I agreed to take him. Jerry insisted on coming along, and I was grateful for the backup. The three of us arrived at the Garrity house just as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the farmland into shadows. Michael approached the house with a confidence that felt misplaced. He pushed open the door and stepped inside, his footsteps echoing through the empty halls. It feels the same, he said softly, almost to himself. The same as when I was a child. Jerry and I exchanged a glance but said nothing. We followed Michael as he made his way to the living room. He stopped in front of the boarded-up closet door, his hand hovering over the wood. It's here, he said quietly. What's here? I asked, my voice low. He turned to face us, his expression grave. The shadow. It's always been here. It feeds on fear, on despair. My aunt's isolation made her the perfect target. And now? Jerry asked. Michael's eyes darkened. Now it's angry. It doesn't like being exposed. At that moment, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. All three of us froze, the air growing heavy and cold. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps followed, each one dragging slightly as if something heavy was being pulled. Michael turned back to the closet. "It knows we're here." The footsteps upstairs grew louder, each one deliberate, echoing through the house. My hand instinctively went to my sidearm, though I doubted it would be much use against whatever we were dealing with. Jerry's face was pale, his eyes locked on the ceiling as the sound moved directly above us. "Stay close," Michael Garrity said. His calm demeanor felt unnerving, as if he were more familiar with the situation than he should have been. He moved toward the staircase, his footsteps steady despite the oppressive air that seemed to thicken with each passing second. "Wait," I said, grabbing his arm. "If this thing is dangerous, we can't just walk into it blind." He looked at me, his dark eyes resolute. "You don't fight it with weapons. You confront it with courage." Before I could argue further, Michael ascended the stairs. Jerry and I exchanged a look, then reluctantly followed. The second floor was shrouded in shadows, the faint light from the setting sun barely penetrating the boarded-up windows. The air felt colder here, and with each step, the sound of our boots seemed unnaturally loud. Michael stopped outside Mrs. Garrity's bedroom. The door was ajar, swinging slightly as if moved by an unseen breeze. Inside, the darkness was almost tangible. He stepped into the room without hesitation, and Jerry and I followed, our flashlights cutting through the gloom. The room was empty, save for the bare mattress and a thick layer of dust on the floor. But the claw marks on the closet door stood out, even in the dim light. They seemed deeper now, as if whatever had made them was growing more desperate. "It's here," Michael said, his voice a whisper. "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my flashlight trained on the closet door. Michael turned to face us. "The shadow. It's drawn to fear and despair. My aunt's suffering fed it, made it stronger, but now it knows we're not afraid. That's why it's trying to intimidate us." As if in response, a low, guttural growl emanated from the closet. The sound wasn't animalistic, but something deeper, more primal. My grip on my flashlight tightened as the door creaked open, inch by inch, revealing a darkness that seemed to pulse and writhe. "Don't look away," Michael warned. "It thrives on doubt." Jerry and I stood frozen, our flashlights trained on the darkness within the closet. Something moved inside, its shape indistinct but undeniably unnatural. My instincts screamed to run, but Michael's words anchored me in place. He stepped closer to the closet, his voice calm but commanding. "You've had your fill. You won't take anyone else." The growl deepened, and for a moment the entire room seemed to vibrate. A shadowy figure began to emerge, its form shifting and undulating as if made of smoke. Its eyes burned red, twin embers in the void. Michael raised his hands, his voice steady. "You have no power here. Leave this place." The figure hesitated, its form flickering. It let out a deafening roar, and the lights in our flashlights flickered and died. For a moment, we were plunged into complete darkness. I felt a cold, suffocating presence pressing against me, a force that seemed to seep into my very bones. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The air lightened, and the oppressive cold lifted. My flashlight sputtered back to life, and I scanned the room. The shadow was gone. The closet door hung open, revealing nothing but an empty space. Michael let out a slow breath. "It's over." Jerry and I stared at him, both of us struggling to process what had just happened. "That's it?" Jerry asked. "It's just gone?" Michael nodded. "For now. These things don't die, not in the way we understand, but it's been weakened, driven away. As long as no one invites it back, this place will be safe." I didn't fully understand what he meant, but I wasn't in the mood to question it. We left the house without looking back. The drive back to the station was silent, each of us lost in our thoughts. The Garrity house was abandoned after that. No one in town wanted anything to do with it, and the property was eventually reclaimed by nature. I never saw Michael Garrity again, though I often wondered if his presence had been a blessing or a curse. As for Mrs. Garrity, she was never found. Her disappearance remained an unsolved mystery, one that haunted me for years. Sometimes in the quiet hours of the night, I would think about her, about the shadow that had tormented her, and I would wonder, had we truly driven it away? Or was it simply waiting, biding its time until it found another victim? Even now, I'm not sure I want to know the answer.